Let's talk about Sukuna, Kenjaku, and this whole merger plan, and a bunch of other questions I've gotten from you guys since JJK chapter 268. So, spoilers beware. All right, so first up today, we got this from Lucas, and it's a bit longer, so y'all can pause to read it. But what Lucas is essentially saying here is that beyond the personal purpose of seeing what happens, Kenjaku doesn't seem all that invested in actually getting the merger to go off, despite having planned it for 1,000 years. And he says that because essentially he just tosses it off to Sukuna, right? And from what we know, we don't really see why Sukuna would have much motivation to make it happen, right? So why would Kenjaku just kind of lackadaisically pass it off to him if that was the case? So what we're going to do is I'm going to give kind of like a very brief recap of this entire little saga regarding the merger. All right, so to begin, why does Kenjaku want this merger to happen? Well, from what we know, it's just morbid curiosity, right? This man has lived for at least 1,000 years, perhaps far longer for all we know, and he wants to see what the next stage of evolution is, how to take cursed energy and existence to that next level. And thus, he has come up with this merger idea. But that wasn't his idea from day one, right? This is after a lifetime, multiple lifetimes of experimenting and iterating and finally landing upon this idea of the merger when all of the dominoes finally lined up with Tengen and, society at the time. So he does want this to happen, and any indifference, I think, is just misplaced. The reason he passed it off to Sukuna was first and foremost, he was dying, right? He was getting his candle snuffed out by Yuta. And because it's so important to him, he pushed it off to Sukuna. Like he said, my will be inherited. Even though you're taking me out, my plans aren't dying here because I'm going to pass it off to Sukuna to make sure he fulfills it. And to answer your question of like, well, why would Sukuna care? And I think he doesn't really. Now, I'll come back to that in a second. But the reason Sukuna has been tasked with this is because he and Kenjaku have a binding vow. Sukuna is like forced to see this through, at least to the best of his ability, because I'm sure that was part of the agreement they had. Now, what exactly were the terms of that vow? We don't know, but here's what we do know. That Kenjaku taught Sukuna how to turn himself into a cursed object. He's the one that taught Sukuna how to become functionally immortal and traverse time via the cursed fingers, right? So in return for that, Sukuna would have had to have given him something. And at the very least, we know that it was protection from Gojo. That was one large, tenet of it. Because as we saw, as soon as Gojo got out of the prison realm, he came to stand on business with Kenjaku, right? But Sukuna jumped in, and Gojo even speculated, okay, they must have some sort of binding vow at play. So I think Sukuna, part of it at least, was to protect Kenjaku, but I believe another part of it was, should something happen to me, I'm going to pass the authority to start this merger to you, Sukuna, and you need to fulfill it. So I think that's why he threw it to Sukuna. And I do think Sukuna would do it because, one, he's bound by the vow, but two, Sukuna, as we saw him state in, I don't remember the exact chapter, but he's like, I'm going to kill you, Yuji, I'm going to kill all of your friends, and then we're going to see what this merger is about. You got to remember, this man has never really been challenged except for Gojo, right? His whole life. That's why he became cursed objects and traversed time for 1,000 years, because he was bored. He was like, let me see what the next era has to offer. So assuming the situation where he did kill everybody and win, he probably would start the merger just to see if that would be a challenge for him, something else to ease his boredom on. So even though he was bound by Kenjaku, I do think he had at least a little bit of curiosity himself to see just what would happen there. And then to address your question of why did this merger stuff kind of take the backseat to the Sukuna situation, and I think it's just because Sukuna represented the more imminent threat, right? They could deal with Kenjaku if Sukuna wasn't in the picture, but as we know, he was protecting Kenjaku up until the moment that the Gojo fight started. And as we know, Yuta went off and dealt with Kenjaku at that point. But even with Kenjaku gone, the merger threat still looms, for the reasons I just stated, and for mostly because the culling games can't just be straight up ended without consequence. Kenjaku took the time to intricately weave it with Tengen barriers and set up all of the rules that it would be very hard to just take that down, right? So Sukuna really represented the biggest problem on the table. Like, again, they can deal with Kenjaku, and if they deal with Sukuna and Kenjaku, then the situation for the merger to go off can never happen, right? Because as we know, all of the players in the culling game, need to die before the merger begins. So effectively, if you deal with Sukuna, you are kind of dealing with the merger as well. Next up, we got another one on the Culling Games from Autistic Tomato, and y'all can pause to read it here, but he's essentially asking for my thoughts on it. And I too agree that I really hope we get something about it in these final 3 chapters. I don't think they have a simple way to end it, but I hope it's addressed and they explain just like what they are going to do about it in some form or fashion. Next up, Marcus says, hey, can you do a list on who the new top 4 special grades are? Yes, but I don't think there's 4. I think there's 2 with an argument to be made for a third, because again, by definition, special grade means you can take on a country by yourself, which means just because somebody could be insanely powerful in like a one-on-one matchup, they still might not be special grade because they just merely lack the ability to take on an entire country at once, right? And it doesn't have to be at once, but you get it. So I would say that Yuji is special grade now, considering he has unlocked Shrine and Domain Expansion and everything else. I think Yuta remains special grade, assuming he comes out the other side of all of this. And then 3, I think Megumi could have an argument to become special grade, even if he doesn't have Shrine. And I put out another video on that. But if he has Shrine, I think he's definitely there. But even if he doesn't, if he, goes on to master the rest of the 10 Shadows using totalities, getting his domain expansion, then I think he would be as well. And then just honorable mention to Toto, who I think's technique just can't get to special grade on its own, but just with his IQ, I don't doubt that he could take over a country if he really wanted to. Next up, we've got an ending theory from David here, who says it'll be the 3 will die, 1 will live scenario, but it's got a little bit of a twist because he says that Nobara, Yuji, and Gojo are going to be the 3 that die, yet they all come back. So he's saying that Gege might have been a little bit cheeky with the way he phrased that because, yeah, 3 did die, but they come back. So certainly optimistic, and 2 out of 3 are right so far, so let's see. Next up, Conversity shares this theory on what if Sukuna in his final moments performed a binding vow to enact the merger on his own soul in order to get his body back or get one more chance. And I think this would have been a cool idea. I think I even speculated that, it would have been cool to see him break a binding vow and try to start the merger or something in his final moments. But I don't think this is that likely just because I think the cast would have known, considering we saw Yuji beat him and then this little time jump to the after conversations that we saw. If Sukuna had done something like that, I felt like it would have already happened. That being said, I don't think that it's impossible for Sukuna to, have some more screen time. Like I said, I personally think he's still within Yuji right now, but I at least don't think that happened in those final moments. I think Megumi is the one with the authority to do anything with the merger at this point. Next up, we got a really kind message from Sean that actually doesn't even include a question, but I'll move out of the way for anybody that wants to pause to read. And man, I just want to say thank you. I truly am so honored that anyone would watch these videos and enjoy it. And it just makes me even happier that people enjoy this stuff as part of their Jujutsu Kaisen journey. So I'm truly honored to be on the ride with you, and thank you so much. Next up, Loki wants to know how Toto swapped Maki when she doesn't have cursed energy. And I think there's a few different possibilities for this. Either A, he just swapped Miwa, who was holding on to Maki, and that might have worked. Or B, he could have done the same thing with the Soul Split Katana if she was holding it. But if either of those wouldn't work, if that doesn't satisfy you, then we know that Miwa could have just imbued some of her own cursed energy into Maki, because we've seen that happen before. Cursed energy gets imbued into a rock, and then Toto is able to swap the rock. So I think it was likely one of those. And then do I think whatever's going on with Yuta has something to do with Kenjaku possibly returning? Maybe. I've talked about how there are different avenues for a potential Kenjaku return, but with only 3 chapters left, I don't know. So that wouldn't be my first guess, but never say never. Next up, we got this from Hugo, who says, I'm curious about your theory of Sukuna living on inside Yuji, because before, when Sukuna was in Yuji, Yuji had those lines on his face under his eyes, and as we saw in 268, Yuji doesn't have those. And this is a really good point, so that could be that, Sukuna is truly gone. But what I'll say is devil's advocate, I still think it's possible because, 1, maybe Gege didn't want to reveal that, but 2, maybe Sukuna in his far weaker form, equivalent to 1 finger or whatever it is, doesn't have enough of an impact on Yuji's body to create those lines. Next, Nico says, if you considered the person who yelled at Yuta at the end of the chapter could have been his unnamed little sister. And no, that honestly didn't even cross my mind. Would be cool, but I think unlikely. And then finally for this video, we got this from Failed, and y'all can pause to read it, but he's essentially sharing his thoughts on how he thought Sukuna's ending was very fitting. And as I'm sure you know, I completely agree. I really enjoyed the culmination of this Yuji Sukuna arc that Gege gave us, so I'm right there with you. That's all for this one, y'all, but don't worry, more on the way to keep us busy during break week. So thank you guys so much for the support, and thank you for watching.